President Trump is vacationing in New Jersey, but his mind is on Washington and the Mueller investigation. That's because the trial is intensifying for the president's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. On Monday, Rick Gates testified. He's a key witness and a former Manafort business associate who's cooperating with the special counsel. Speaking before a grand jury in Arlington, Virginia, Gates said he assisted Manafort in filing false tax returns and did not disclose foreign bank accounts at Manafort's request. He pleaded guilty back in February to conspiracy and lying to the FBI. This all comes as President Trump appears to be feeling the heat on the Russia probe. On Sunday, he reversed himself on the meeting held at Trump Tower during the 2016 presidential campaign between top aides and a Russian attorney. In a tweet, he acknowledged the meeting was meant to get information on his opponent, but he also says he did not know anything about it. That explanation contradicts past statements, including the initial one by his son, Donald Trump Jr., who last summer claimed the meeting was about adoptions. It was later reported the president himself dictated the original misleading statement. Here's what his lawyer had to say Sunday about the ever-changing narrative.
I think it's very important to point out that in a situation like this, you have, over time, facts develop. That's what investigations do.
We'll have more on the Trump Tower meeting ahead, but first, here's CBS News Washington correspondent Paula Reed with the latest on the Manafort trial.
The tax and bank fraud trial of former campaign chairman Paul Manafort continues today. The trial got off to a late start this afternoon around 1 p.m. and defense attorneys cross-examined Manafort's former accountant, Cynthia Laporta. Last week, she testified that she altered Manafort's tax returns based on information she didn't actually believe to be true. Now, the jury also heard this afternoon from former deputy campaign chairman Richard Gates. Now, Gates entered a plea deal with special counsel after he and Manafort were charged together. He agreed to testify against Manafort in exchange for leniency in his own case. Now, if convicted, Manafort faces up to life in prison, but sources close to the case say he is banking on a presidential pardon. Paula Reed, CBS News, Alexandria, Virginia.
Joining me now are CBSN political contributor and political reporter for The Guardian, Sabrina Siddiqui, and Bloomberg's chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli. All right, Sabrina, let me start with you. What do we know about the strategy of Paul Manafort's defense attorneys?
Well, look, Paul Manafort has been charged or is facing 18 counts and will, if convicted, spend the rest of his life in prison. He obviously chose not to strike a plea deal with federal prosecutors, unlike his deputy Rick Gates and some of the other former Trump campaign officials who were indicted by Robert Mueller. It seems like what Paul Manafort is doing is he's holding out hope that if he were, in fact, convicted and sent to prison, that perhaps there could be a presidential pardon down the road. I also think it's worth noting that while the trial in Virginia deals a lot more with the financial issues, such as potential tax evasion and bank fraud, they're not entirely unrelated to the Russia investigation insofar as what we've learned in this trial is Paul Manafort's firm was losing hundreds of thousands of dollars each month at a time when he was working for the Trump campaign for free. So the other question this obviously raises is, what was Paul Manafort's source of income in 2016, and was he perhaps trying to use his position on the campaign to peddle influence overseas?
Yeah, so Kevin, help us understand this a little bit better. How does this trial of Paul Manafort's factor into special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election?
Elaine, it's simple. Follow the money. And that's exactly what I would totally agree with Sabrina, because, look, when you follow the money, it really does lead to a lot of these answers. Now, look, the Trump sources that I speak with note that Paul Manafort and the charges that are against him, including conspiring against the United States, date back to his financial dealings back in the Ukraine, in which he was advocating for a pro-Russia type of faction of government. The bottom line is that you've seen Rick Gates, his deputy and frequent confidant on the campaign trail back in 2016, completely have a reversal. Rick Gates is the original Michael Cohen for all intents and purposes, and how he has essentially completely reversed course and is now cooperating fully with the special counsel. That tweet that was played earlier by President Trump, also a complete acknowledgement of that June 2016 meeting in Trump Tower with Paul Manafort, with Donald Trump Jr. and Russian attorney Natalia Veselnitskaya, that originally was portrayed, Elaine, as something of an adoption of sorts for a Russian policy, something that has bogged down the policy wonks here for decades inside of Washington, D.C. But now we are hearing that, of course, that was about political dirt. The second point that I would quickly note is just how quickly Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney now, has said that collusion is not a crime.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we have heard from him over and over. I want to ask, though, if you are President Trump and you're listening to all this, Kevin, and you're hearing all of these latest developments, what is it in particular that you were looking for with respect to Paul Manafort's trial?
Well, look, I think that should there be any direct connection to the campaign trail or any time that these charges extend into the president's campaign or any communication between Paul Manafort and President Trump, that would be of interest, of course, to the president. We should note that the White House announced a lid, as it's called, inside of the Beltway for the White House press corps earlier this afternoon. The president golfing on vacation in New York, or I'm sorry, in his New Jersey country club this afternoon. So no public scheduled events for today. We had heard rumblings that his legal team was huddled together, Elaine, trying to decide whether or not the president would, in fact, testify with Bob Mueller's team.
Yeah, I mean, that continues to be an open question. Well, over the weekend, we mentioned this tweet, the president tweeting about the 2016 meeting between his son, Donald Trump Jr., and a Russian lawyer. And just to remind people, the president and his son had previously stated that that meeting was, in fact, about Russian adoptions. And now the president is saying it was to get information on an opponent. So, Sabrina, the question is timing here. Why is the president making this tweet-formed sort of admission, acknowledgement right now?
Well, one can presume that his son is in a lot of trouble, that Donald Trump Jr. in particular faces a lot of legal jeopardy, and the president is concerned about his son, and he's trying to effectively litigate this in the court of public opinion, which is what we have seen from the president more broadly when it comes to the Russia investigation. He is so fixated on it. It's something he tweets about near daily. Certainly his behavior is not that of someone who is not actually concerned with the direction of the investigation. And I think you do have to look at the trajectory of what we know about this meeting. First, we didn't even know that the meeting took place. Then it was framed as being innocuous about adoptions. Well, then we find out that it's because Donald Trump Jr. was directly offered dirt on Hillary Clinton. We don't know what, if anything, came out of the meeting. Certainly Donald Trump Jr. says that nothing did. But that's something that Paul Manafort has a lot more information about. And we know that it's one of the issues that he is most interested in, both with respect to potential collusion between the Trump campaign and Moscow, because Donald Trump Jr.'s emails at least indicated a willingness to collude, but also with respect to obstruction of justice by the president. What role did the president have? As we know, he did craft that very misleading statement about the meeting. Why did he craft that misleading statement, and what did he know about the meeting before? He said he didn't know anything, but, you know, is that something that Robert Mueller will be looking into very closely?
Yeah, and Sabrina, I mean, Kevin mentioned there's a lid, so there's no other information or activity expected, at least not on the official schedule of the president. But how is the White House explaining all of this?
Well, I think that, frankly, the White House has tried not to wade into the president's tweets insofar as they always have the same line that we hear time and again, that they speak for themselves. I think that because Congress is away, they've expected a quiet week. Now, we know that the president, when left to his own devices, it will continue to be unfiltered, and he likes to use his Twitter account as a forum to communicate with the public. What we have seen, and what the White House has played into, is that the president and his legal team are trying to discredit the entire investigation, to frame it as a witch hunt, to try and undermine the work of Robert Mueller. The president on multiple occasions has refused to explicitly rule out firing the special counsel or Rod Rosenstein, the deputy attorney general. And so I think what you see is that ultimately, if the president's legal team is banking on there not being an indictment of a sitting president, which would be fairly unprecedented, they can at least try to persuade the public as to to whether or not this was a fair and independent investigation. Certainly, there's been no evidence to support the president's claim that it is in any way tainted, but that's where the strategy, both on the part of the president and the White House, is.
And Kevin, of course, this tweet just came over the weekend from the president, but do we know yet in a fulsome way what some of the political and legal consequences of this information provided by the president could be?
Well, in terms of the politics, if you look at polling, virtually every poll would suggest that the Republican Party and the base of the Republican Party are still very much backing President Trump and his political coalition. And in fact, even digging deeper, there seems to be a deep mistrust in the investigation itself on behalf of the base of the Republican Party. That said, up on Capitol Hill, as Sabrina mentioned, recess, not much action going on Capitol Hill. You are seeing senior Republicans disagree with the president on a host of various things. I've talked with several Republicans last week, for example, who told me point blank they believe the investigation ought to continue, including Senator Marco Rubio, a Republican from Florida. Earlier today, Senator Lindsey Graham distancing himself from President Trump on his attacks against the media, as the president frequently likes to refer to them as a quote-unquote enemy of the people. That said, there's a big special election coming up in the next 24 hours. The president weighing in his political capital in Ohio, trying to, once was a heavily conservative district, rallying the troops, including with Congressman Jim Jordan, a Republican of Ohio, to bolster what has become what Democrats are hoping will be a bellwether ahead of the midterm elections in November.
Let's turn to another topic. The White House Monday announced new sanctions on Iran. These were sanctions the president had promised when he pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in May. Kevin, what do we know about these sanctions, and what is the administration hoping to achieve with them?
Well, the president enacting those first round of sanctions against Iran earlier today. The second round of sanctions will take effect in mid-November. This comes at a time in which the energy sector in particular is carefully watching this. Now, if you dig deeper into the details, there are some exemption waivers that could be provided for some countries and how they regard business with Iran in the energy sector. Now, whether you're a progressive or a conservative in Europe, they are all distancing themselves from the U.S. position of withdrawing from the Iran nuclear disarmament deal. They felt that the lifting of sanctions in exchange for Iran dismantling or beginning to dismantle their nuclear weapons was a positive for the global community. Iran, for their part, actually, Elaine, had begun preparing for the weakening of these, or for the implementation of these sanctions by weakening some of the regulations in their central bank. The bottom line, this is an escalation and a doubling down of President Trump and his administration's policies by imposing these sanctions at a time in which he's frequently relying on Secretary Pompeo and UN Ambassador Nikki Haley to try to get Iran back to the negotiating table for a new nuclear disarmament deal.
So, Sabrina, speaking of Secretary Pompeo, he said the administration is hopeful that they can work with Iran, but that moving forward requires, quote, enormous change on the part of the Iranian regime. So what does that mean? Has the White House provided any indication as to what that change might look like?
Well, in a conference call with reporters just today, as the reimposition of sanctions was being rolled out, senior administration officials said that they are not by any means pursuing regime change, that they simply want the behavior of the existing regime to change course. Now, that is, of course, very difficult to achieve, especially when the president, against the urging of key U.S. allies, walked away from the 2015 nuclear accord, which by design was intended to bring Tehran to the negotiating table and to try and achieve stability in the Middle East. The administration also stressed that President Trump is open to meeting Iranian President Hassan Rouhani without any conditions attached, so that was notable as well. But we don't know, of course, that the plans for any such meeting are currently underway. So far, what we do have is allies in Europe as well as Russia, the other signatories to the nuclear accord, trying to brace for the impact of the U.S. reinstating its own sanctions. The European Union just today moved to try and protect companies in Europe from any legal challenges that would arise from the Trump administration's preferred course of action, which, as we know, has further alienated the U.S. on yet another issue from its key partners overseas.
All right, we'll continue to watch it all. Sabrina Siddiqui and Kevin Cirilli, always great to have your insight. Thank you both.
Thank you,
Elaine.